Good day, everyone. Today, we are going to learn about Coming of Life Part 2. When the book of Earth opened its first page, all these tiny creatures were already there, living in the water. Some of them are all gone, but some of them are still alive until today. Here, we have the Bluff of Jelly, a one-celled creature which did all of its work. It had no shell. Here's another called a flagellate, with two little whips to help it move about. There were sponges, which were made up of many cells, all doing the same job. Here's another one that stayed in the same place, with arms or like feathers, catching little animals and putting them into their mouths. Those were the Etinoderms Sea Anemones. Like this stayed in one place. This creature is made up of a group of cells. In order to get food, they moved the water with these long, thin body parts so tiny creatures in the water would come into their mouths. There was one kind of creature that could be found in ancient seas in great numbers. They are known as Trilobites. They were sort of like lobsters of our present day. Trilobites were the most advanced creatures of their time. They grew in many shapes and sizes. Today, we no longer have these creatures, but they were around for a long time at the beginning of life on Earth. As time went on, all kinds of creatures appeared. All sorts of experiments went on. Look here! This creature is called Cephalopod. It has its legs attached to its head. Cephalo means head and pod means foot. So they were the head-footed animals. As time went on, all kinds of animals appeared. Here we have creatures that look like flowers, but they were not flowers at all. They stayed in one place like the sea anemones. They built stone houses for their jelly-like creatures. Some of them were made out of one cell. They took the salt out of the sea and built stone rings, one on top of each other to look like flowers on a stalk. The feathery parts were what they waved about in the water so that any little creature passing by could be grabbed and eaten by them. Because of their looks and colors, they were called sea lilies. They were animals, not plants. When they died, the stone rings collapsed and fell to the bottom of the sea. The waters were full of life this time. As time went on, all kinds of animals appeared. There were creatures of long ago who, instead of eating other creatures, they made their own food out of sunlight and salts in the water. They were the first seaweeds. They too drifted along the sea, and at some point later, some of them decided to see what was like at the edge of the land. They floated on the tides and remained on the rocks until the tides remained. As they remained out of the water, they found out that they liked it there, for there was plenty of sunlight and the air was full of a gas that they needed to make food. So, they remained at the edge of the sea, making their own food and feeding themselves. And when they died, their bodies prepared the ground for other life forms to come, and gradually others joined them. This was the first time that life tried out the land. These were the ones that developed into the first plants. For the first time, plants appeared on the land. Life was now moving on the land. While plants were trying out the land, two new kinds of animals appeared in the sea. One of these was the coral polyp, which helped to build up the land by eating salts in the sea. And the other was a strange little animal with a rod inside. It was the beginning of animals with backbones. And at this time, animals developed into the first Fish. There was a great variety of fish that grew in the ocean. These fish were different from those we have today. They were enormous with hard shells on the outside to protect themselves. They had heavy armor in their bodies and were not able to move around very fast. They remained buried in the mud, hiding so they could catch animals as they passed by. Some could swim very swiftly, and they developed movable fins which helped them to swim better. And then slowly over a period of time, the land in some places started to rise up, and in some places the oceans were cut off. In these places where there was very little rainfall, the land started to dry up. If you need water for your life, what are you going to do? You either solve the problem or else you are going to die. The fish living in these places had to do something or else they were going to die. Some of them said, I'm going to put a sack in my body so I can breathe. So they decided to build a sack inside their body with water in it so that when there was no water, they could still breathe. So the secret of breathing outside of water was invented. So came the amphibians, animals that live partly in water and partly on land. The fins became useless, so they were changed into legs so that they could walk on land. Something wonderful happened when the amphibians came. The sound of the first voice was heard, a voice on the land. The silence except the sound from a falling rocks or rain was broken with the voice of a frog. Imagine how exciting it would have been to have heard the first sound ever to be made on land. Meanwhile, the plants had left the sea. They grew in great variety and size, eating and making their own food with air and sunlight. The insects also came, so there was food around for the amphibians. They had a great time except for one little problem. Because of the way their skin is made, the amphibians needed to stay near the water to keep them from drying out and to lay their eggs. Some of them did not like this. Some wanted to be free from water. They wanted to be independent. They wanted to go further into the land where there was plenty of food. They decided and developed a skin that did not dry out even under the sun. They also developed a shell for their eggs. Now, there was no problem. These kinds of animals were called reptiles. Now, with the new skin that didn't dry out and eggs that didn't have to be laid in the water, these animals could move inland freely where there were plenty of tall plants to eat and lots of delicious insects. They also ate the amphibians. And then what happened? The reptiles had a good time and they grew and grew. Some of them grew enormously. There was no one to stop these creatures, and they became the lords and masters of the world. They took over the land and the seas, and they even took control of the air. Here is a picture of one of these creatures. Do you know how big this creature was? 80 feet long. This creature had a head that was as big as a man's body. Our classroom is 30 feet long. This animal would fill more than 3 rooms like this. Look at this. He was so big. There was something peculiar about this creature. It had a brain in its head and another down near the base of its tail, so that messages from the tail didn't have to travel all the way to the head and acted upon. Can you imagine how the earth must have shaken as these huge creatures stomped around? These animals had everything they wanted. The little animals had no chance against these big animals. And so, the smaller animals fled to where it was cold, where the large reptiles could not live and could not get to them. As time went on, these animals that lived on the fringes where it was cold developed something to protect them from the cold. They developed hair or fur and a way to keep their blood warm without sunlight. These were the first birds and first mammals. What about their eggs? They knew very well what happened to eggs that were left alone, so some began to carry them inside their bodies. The birds, however, could not carry their eggs very long because they had to fly, and it would make them too heavy. They built nests for their eggs. They sat on their eggs to keep them warm. When the little ones hatched, they fed and guarded them until they were big enough to leave the nest. The mammals kept their eggs inside their body until they were ready to be born. When the babies were born, they fed them with their own milk. This was very new. No other animals did this before. Other animals just left their eggs and some of the eggs were eaten by other animals. The young ones had to look after themselves. The children of birds and mammals remained with their parents until they could take care of themselves. The weather began to change again. It began to get colder and colder. The dinosaurs disappeared, though no one is really sure why this happened. Then the mammals took over. They grew and grew. They were able to go everywhere. There were giant animals like giant hippopotami and giant elephants. The mammals had a good time, even as it got colder and huge sheets of ice covered much of the earth. The mammals moved all over the earth in search of food and warmer weather. In the end, none of the giant mammals were able to survive. Something very exciting happened towards the end of a very cold period. A completely new kind of creature emerged. It did not have sharp teeth to eat with, nor huge claws to fight with, nor fur. But it had something that none of the others had. It had a larger brain and had the power to think and imagine. This creature also had an enormous amount of love. It was different from other animals because this animal could go beyond the love of its own children. It could love others even others would never see. This creature was a human being. You see, it was as if all of this had to happen in order for the man to come. Human beings would not have found it possible to live if they'd come too early or when the plants were first trying out the land. At the end, though everything was ready, if the earth had a voice, it would have said, I have spread myself thick with carpets of grass for your feet so you can walk on soft ground. I have put flowers in my hair and covered myself with jewels for your pleasure. My cupboards are full of milk, meats, fruits, and vegetables for you to eat. Down in the cellars are coal and iron. All of me is ready. It is time for you human beings to come. And so we are here. This was all prepared for us. And now we are part of the history. That's all about coming of life.